Most Chinese characters are compounds consisting of two or more components. But some components are in themselves compounds that can be further broken down. But how do you know where to stop? And how do you learn and remember the most basic building blocks? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to continue our discussion about the Chinese writing system that we started in the previous episode. And before you listen to this one, I suggest you go back and listen to the previous one, that's episode 54, where we talked about the writing system in general and some things to keep in mind while you learn it. We also looked at the structure of this series, and in this part we are going to look at the most basic characters. So like I said in the intro, you can often break compounds down into smaller components. But sometimes these components can then also be broken down. So a question becomes, how far can you break things down? And obviously you can break things down until you get to individual strokes, but that is not very useful. So we need to have a standard for how far we're going to break things down, and eventually we will get to the smallest meaningful unit, the one we can use to understand these characters and also to learn them. So today we are talking about those basic characters that can't or at least shouldn't be broken down into smaller parts. And how do you learn these? Because as I've said before, and we will look at in the next episode, learning compounds is about learning the components and how they fit together. Kind of understanding that is immensely helpful. But if you get to the smallest meaningful unit, there is no breaking down to do. You can't really understand them in that way. So what do you do with these characters? How do you learn them? Before we get into that, I'd just like to say that, as usual, there is an accompanying article on Hacking Chinese, as some of these things are rather hard to talk about without being able to show them. I mean, we're talking about something visual, Chinese characters, and that can sometimes be a bit tricky in the podcast format, but I'll do my best. Let's start by talking a little bit how written language emerged. If you haven't studied the history of language in general, you might not really have thought about this much, like why did we start writing? We've always been speaking, or as long as we've been humans, we have spoken. But writing is something relatively new, and it's something we actually started doing. It's not something natural that just came to us. And of course, nobody knows exactly how we started writing, because none of that is around, and we cannot ask anybody who lived back then. But it's not that hard to imagine a situation where writing came about, and there is some evidence to support a theory similar to this one. So for example, imagine that we have a granary where we store grains and other things we need. And of course we do this in sealed vessels because that's way, well, it lasts longer. Now it's very inconvenient to not know what's in a vessel, so someone had a good idea to maybe draw something that's similar to wheat, for example, on the outside of the vessel so we know what's stored in it. That's not writing in itself, really. It's just a picture of what's inside of the vessel, which is not very fancy. But then maybe someone had the brilliant idea to take this symbol that we had, this picture, and start using it to represent wheat somewhere else, not on this vessel itself. For example, maybe it was convenient to have a record of what was in this granary, and then you can do this using these symbols. And of course, if you have some basic way of counting, maybe basic numbers, this system could develop into something fairly complex that could be used to keep track of, say, everything we store in this building. And then also trade and taxes and so on, because people care about that. Another thing that people care about is gods and what they think about the future, so divination in other words. And that is actually where we have records of the oldest Chinese characters from something called oracle bone script. So these are characters that are carved into animal bones or tortoise shells, and then these shells are heated up and they crack. And by the way the cracks run across the surface and through these characters, you can then divine what will happen in the future, or if an enterprise is a good idea or a bad idea, or things like that. And these started appearing in the Shang dynasty, which is about a little bit more than 3,000 years ago, and of course things have happened with the writing system since then. So even if a character started out being quite similar to the thing it depicted, that's not necessarily the case today, and the character might look very different, and sometimes the original character doesn't really look like the object either. So characters started out as pictures, but then they grew into a writing system, and here there is a difference between writing and drawing, which is very important to understand. So when we draw something, we do it to resemble something else. Or I mean, that's one of the reasons we do it. So if you ask 100 people to draw a tree, you will get 100 different trees. But if we ask 100 Chinese people to write the character for a tree, we will not get 100 completely different pictures, as it were. We will get slight variations of a standardized form. So that is the big difference between writing and drawing. Writing is standardized and the purpose is communication, and to do that we need to agree on how something is written. Okay, so now we have a bunch of characters that started out as pictures but aren't really pictures anymore. And so then you might ask, can't you break these down further? So let's take an example. If we have the character for tree, mu, it basically looks like a plus sign with slanting strokes going out from the center and then down left and down right. Can't you then break that down into further smaller components? For example, if you've learned to count in Chinese, you know that the number 10 is actually written just like a plus sign. And the number 8 is written as two slanting strokes next to each other. So if we combine those, don't we get a tree? I mean, visually it certainly looks like that. But the answer here is no. We can of course go back and look at how these characters have evolved, and there is nothing in the origin of the character for tree that makes us think that it should be 10 plus 8, which doesn't make much sense anyway. Instead, it just looks to be a picture of a tree. So this is what I mean when I say that it can sometimes be difficult to break characters down to the right level. If you go to the level of tree, you are right and you shouldn't go further. But if you then take another step and go to 10 plus 8 makes tree, then you've broken it down too much. This is a little bit like taking the letter D and trying to understand it as a C plus an L, which clearly doesn't make sense, but visually it looks like a C plus an L, right? And sometimes resources here are very unhelpful. Most free dictionaries and online dictionaries and sites for learning Chinese characters don't really make a good job out of this at all, and they just tell you that tree consists of 10 and 8, whereas in fact it doesn't at all, and that is not even particularly helpful to learn the character. I will later in this episode go through a few resources that I think you should use to really understand these things, but I'll save that for a little bit later. Around this time, I think some listeners will have thought about the word radical, and I've been consistently saying character component, but there is also something called a radical, so what's the difference there? And I use radical sometimes too, because I know people search for it and everybody wants to know about radicals, but we're usually talking about character components. I even have an article called Kickstart Your Chinese Character Learning with the 100 Most Common Radicals. So, to see what the difference is, we need to understand what a radical is. A radical is a component in a character that is used to sort that character in a dictionary. So, all characters that have the same radical, such as tree we just talked about, they will be in the same section of the dictionary. And then all the characters that have the water radical will be in another section. And this way we can look something up without knowing how it's pronounced, and we can find information about the characters. Now, where this gets slightly unintuitive for most people is that each character only has one radical. So regardless of how many components there is only one radical, because that's the way one we use when we sort it in a dictionary. So if you take a character like Ming, bright, which we looked at in the previous episode, it consists of sun and moon. And in that character, it's only sun that is the radical. The moon is not a radical. But in another character, moon might very well be the radical, so that's the way it's sorted in a dictionary. So you can't just look at a character and then take any of the components and think it's a radical, it's just one. Or at least according to a specific standard or a specific dictionary, there's just one radical in each character. So you can't say, okay, I'm going to break this character down into radicals. That doesn't make sense, we just have one. So you can find that one if you want to, but actually the only thing that's useful for is if you're using a printed dictionary and looking things up this way, which is extremely rare these days. We don't need to do that. We use electronic dictionaries, which are many times faster, and we don't need to remember which is the radical. So why do people still talk about radicals? Why do I talk about radicals? Well, it's because many people simply think that radical means character component. So if I want to get people to read my articles and benefit from, say, the Kickstart list that I made, I need to use the word radical. And this is also partly accurate, of course, because the list that I made actually look at characters that are used as radicals and checked which of them are the most common and therefore that you should learn them and in what order. However, the reason that they are important is not because they are radicals actually, it is because they are common components. If you focus too much on radicals, you will make two mistakes. The first is that you will learn lots of characters that are used as radicals, but aren't actually very common. The second problem is that you will miss lots of characters that are common components in other characters, but are never used as radicals. For example, 中, middle, as in 中国, for example, is a very common character component, but it is never used as a radical. Okay, let's discuss how to learn these basic components then. If you can't break them down and understand them that way, it's basically memorizing a picture, an idealized form of a picture, or a symbol that at least at some point in history used to be a picture. So the first thing you should do is to look up what the actual origin of this character is, because that can sometimes be very helpful. If we take the character for fire, for example, you can actually see a flame with sparks flying off, or at least you can imagine it. It's not that hard. And if you look at Shan, mountain, you can sort of think that there are 3 mountain peaks there. Or at least once someone has told you that, or you've realized that, it becomes much easier to remember how to write that character. And the same goes for the character for field, which is simply a square area divided into 4 plots. This can also be useful in cases which are less obvious. So if you look at the character for eye, for example, which is basically a box with 3 divisions horizontally, you might think that that doesn't resemble an eye at all, and it doesn't. But what if you put it on its side and you imagine that the middle bit is the iris and the outer areas are the whites? Well, it then kind of does resemble an eye, and having this image in your mind can make it a lot easier to remember both how to read and how to write this character. And like I said initially, you should head over to the article on Hacking Chinese if you want to see what I'm doing here. I show the characters and I also show the evolution of these characters with historical forms to show you how they have evolved. So let's move on to tricky cases, meaning characters that when you look them up don't seem to make that much sense to you. This is a little bit personal, so sometimes you think that, oh, I can definitely see that this looks like a hand or a boat or whatever the character resembles. But sometimes you just can't. You look at the origin and you say, I have no idea what this is, and it's not helpful. You might even have tried and just keep forgetting it because the image is not clear enough for you. In these cases, you can make something up. That's completely fine. For example, let's say that you've encountered the character zhou, which is a component in the more common character chuan, boat. And this character component means boat, and maybe it looks like a boat, maybe not, but let's say you don't think it's very helpful. If you think it looks like, say, the surface of the sea and you have a submarine with a tower sticking up over the waves and then maybe a periscope or people inside of the tower or something like that, that's completely fine if it helps you to remember the character. Naturally, you should know that this is obviously not how the character came about, and you shouldn't expect other dots to represent periscopes or people or the vertical line here to represent the sea or something like that. That's just something you made up, but if it helps you remember the character, I think that's not a problem. However, what you should be very careful about is mixing up components. So what I just described was taking a unit that cannot be divided, the zhou, the component meaning boat, and I made up a picture for it. That is okay. But you should never mix components. So if we have a character like xiu that we looked at in the previous episode, that means to rest, and it's composed of a person and a tree, and you get the idea of a person resting against the tree or under the tree or something like that. Well, let's say you don't think that this makes sense and you want to make up your own story. Then by all means do so, but make sure that you have person and tree in your story. Don't look at them together as a picture. Remember, the goal here is to understand the building blocks so that we can make learning to read and write Chinese easier by reducing the task from learning, thousands and thousands of pictures to learning a few hundred pictures and how to combine them, essentially. And if you start combining components with each other in ways that they are not supposed to be combined and create new images, well, then you're just creating more pictures to learn and it becomes much harder again. So the general approach then is to break something down to the smallest meaningful unit and see if that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, you can break it down further. The example I brought up earlier with 10 and 8 making up tree is a little bit stupid, I think, because the tree character itself kind of looks like a tree, so it's not that hard to remember. But there are other cases that are more complicated. For example, if we take a character like yu, fish, it looks like it has a field in it, the square with plots of land in it, but actually it doesn't. If you look at the origin of this character, these are probably just the scales of the fish, and it's completely unrelated to field. It just happens to be written the same way in the modern form. So this means that remembering how to write fish by thinking of field is a little bit similar to using the 10 and the 8 to remember how to write tree, meaning that it has nothing to do with the origin of the character, but that you can use this if you find it helpful for remembering how to write the character. So we've talked about a few examples now. For examples, you know that you can break down xiu into person and tree, but that you shouldn't break down tree into 8 and 10. But how do you know this as a student? Well, you can't figure it out just by looking at the character, that's for sure. So you need to use some tool or some resource. And that's what I do too. I'm not an expert in Chinese characters, but I know where to look and I know how to find the information that I want. So the first tool that I will suggest is Pleco. And Pleco is a dictionary I think most of you already use, and if you don't, you should at least check it out. And the basic version is free, but it does then suffer from some problems that I mentioned earlier. So for example, if you do look up tree in Pleco, the character we've been talking about in this episode, it will break it down into 10 and 8. And it won't really tell you that that's not the way it's supposed to be. It's just a visual graphical breakdown. It has nothing to do with the origin of this character, and you can't break it down like that in order to understand it, in the way you can break down the character for rest into person and tree. Pleco comes with a lot of add-ons though, that cost money but are well worth it. So the add-on that I want to recommend here is the Outlier Linguistics Dictionary of Chinese Characters, which wasn't around when I started learning characters, but I really wish it would have been. In this dictionary, you can look up most characters, you can see what the components are, if there are any, what functions they have in the character, which is something we will talk about more in the next episode, and you can also see if there are breakdowns you really shouldn't do. If it just says that something is a picture, well then it is a picture, it's not a combination of something else, even though it might look like that. I've written an in-depth review of the Outlier dictionary, so if you click the link in the description, you can check it out in more detail. If you really don't want to buy anything at all, you can still use Wiktionary, which sometimes offers fairly in-depth explanations of characters, although it's not as easily accessible and can sometimes be a little bit hard to understand. Lastly, I would like to recommend Scritter, which I talked about at great length in episode 53, so I will not say that much about it here. But I will say that I have developed a character course for Scritter that covers roughly the same things as this series does, although in more detail and in video format, and you can practice writing in the app and so on. But if you're interested in Scritter, I think you should check out episode 53 or check my review, which will also be in the description of this episode. So now that we know what the most basic characters are, where they came from, and how to learn them, I also want to say a few things about some things that can trip you up or make you confused if you're not aware of them. The first one is simplified and traditional characters. So as the name implies, simplified characters were part of an effort to make Chinese characters easier by standardizing simpler forms of the characters, and this was done around 70 years ago in China. Note that easier here means fewer strokes, which is not necessarily what makes a character easy or difficult for us as foreigners. It certainly makes it faster to write by hand, but for example, when it comes to recognition, there are certain advantages with traditional characters as well. So it's not the case that simplified characters are just easier or something like that. Most characters are in fact exactly the same in both sets, so if you learn one of them, you need to learn a few rules and systematic changes, and then some tricky cases, and then you will know the other one. So which one you learn is not that important. I usually suggest that people start with simplified unless they have a specific reason to learn traditional first. For example, I started with simplified, but then I moved to Taiwan with a scholarship after a year of studying, and then of course I started learning traditional characters. And like I said, which one you use is not that important. It feels like there's a very big difference when you start out, but the more advanced you get, the less this difference matters. Finally, I also want to say a few words about character variants and fonts for language learners, because this can also be tricky. Most of the time, your phone and computer will display Chinese characters correctly, but I just want to make you aware of the fact that that might not always be the case. So if you look at a character on your phone or in a newspaper or something like that, it might not look exactly like your teacher writes it on the whiteboard or the way it looks in your textbook. And this is because complicated relationships between variants of characters and also just styles in how particular strokes are written or specific components are written. So a good example of this is gu, which means bone, as in gu tao. This is not a simplified character, so if you look this up in a table with all the simplified characters and their traditional counterparts, this character will not show up because it's considered the same character. Yet it is often written differently in traditional Chinese and simplified Chinese. In simplified Chinese, the little box inside the box at the top is written on the left, whereas in traditional characters, this is usually written on the right. Another difference is that the strokes at the bottom are completely horizontal in simplified Chinese, whereas in traditional Chinese, they are usually slanting. These differences will typically never cause trouble for people when they read your writing or anything like that. Very, very pedantic teachers might correct you on this, but for communication purposes, it matters not at all. If this is very confusing and you've encountered cases that you don't understand, I suggest that you check out my article, Chinese Character Variants and Fonts for Language Learners, where I go into much more detail, bring up many more examples of how this works, and also give you a method for how to check if you're using a font that kind of conforms to the standard you are after. Okay, I think that wraps up part 2 of this series about the building blocks of Chinese. And in the next part, we are going to look at compounds. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.